All right, we are back onto the topic of polygamy, primarily Joseph Smith's polygamy or non-polygamy, depending on which side of the fence that you're on. This has been exhausting, absolutely exhausting, but I think you're going to enjoy this episode with Brian Hales. He's got a lot of information that he's going to share with us. People are very emotional about this topic. We had over 3,300 comments on the last interview with Michelle Stone last week. So it is very much a lightning rod cultural issue among Latter-day Saints. Now, I want to be clear, when I did an interview previously about a month ago with Jacob Hansen, I think it was pretty clear where I fell on this. And with Michelle, I told her before we even recorded where my conclusions were, that I disagreed with her. But I'm glad she did all this research. I'm glad she does all of this. I wish more of us did that. I wish more of us delved into the scriptures that way. I just don't agree with her conclusions. And apparently that is not okay with a number of people. But so be it. All right, so this episode is brought to you by Scripture Notes. Scripture Notes is the application I've told you about previously that I've used for my book, which is coming out shortly. It is the application I use for all of my scripture study. You see here I've got section 132 and chapter 2 of Jacob up, which are both pertinent to this discussion here today. It is by far the most powerful scripture study tool out there, in my humble opinion. Go to scripturenotes.com to find out more. Scripturenotes.com. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have brought on polygamy expert Brian Hales, retired anesthesiologist who's published plentiful on Joseph Smith and polygamy. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Really appreciate you doing this. There is right now, and I know you've noticed this, but there's a lot of talk about polygamy, about denying Joseph Smith's polygamy, about denying polygamy overall, going through the scriptures. Let's start with that. Why do you think this phenomenon is happening today?
You know, I think that the church bears some responsibility, and I'm not here to point fingers at the leaders. I love these men. But if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, I think what happened was that church leaders were seeing a lot of media attention to what we would call the Mormon fundamentalist polygamists of that era. And if you go to my website, I hope it's okay to plug it, it's mormonfundamentalism.com. You'll see pictures that are rolling across the home page. Many of them are taken from Life magazine, Collier's, these big outlets, media outlets for the time. And I think Heber J. Grant was pretty bothered by this, and he wanted to emphasize that we are a monogamous church. And so they created this policy that we're just going to talk about us as monogamous. We're not going to delve into our polygamous past. We're not going to program discussions of polygamy or Joseph Smith and the origin into our curriculums, our Sunday curriculums. We're not going to talk about it in general conference. And we notice also about this time, we also have church historian who's an apostle, Joseph Fielding Smith, and he seems to embrace this mentality just as well. If it was a policy, then he's embracing it, because we don't find anybody researching the documents to try to find out exactly what happened. They aren't searching through the archives. Of course, there's lots of archives that aren't being researched through this time. They just don't have the number of people there helping. But we find that virtually nothing is happening in the church to research Joseph Smith and early polygamy up until about the 2000s. And so the early church leaders have created a policy that was great for them. And I understand why they would do that. But when we go to the 2000s and the internet shows up, not everything the anti-Mormons are saying about Joseph Smith and polygamy is false. And so what we find in the 2000s is an attempt to address the fact that this hasn't been talked about for many, many decades. Now, we do have Widsoe, John H. Widsoe, who was an apostle, who came out very cleanly, and I think it was the 1950s, talking about Joseph's polygamy. And there are a few other scattered references here and there. Joseph Fielding Smith published Blood Atonement and the Origin of Plural Marriage. So, it wasn't entirely sterile. But what we find is it's just not part of the curriculum. So many members are unaware of what was happening. And so the church plays a little bit of catch up there. In the 2000s, I met with Elder Jensen, who was then church historian, wonderful man, and Rick Turley. And they're saying, well, we're trying to figure out how to create a new product that can teach the members, about this time period. And they came up with the gospel topic essay that was published in 2014. And I think that caught a lot of people by surprise. They didn't really know Joseph was the originator of this practice. And so I think the fact that we didn't talk about it for so many years had kind of set up a scenario where individuals are going to say, I don't think Joseph would have done that. It's really bad for women, and Joseph was a nice guy, and I just don't think that would happen. So anyway, does that make sense at all there, Greg?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's just so funny. I've had a couple commenters, in fact, on previous episodes that have said, I can't believe in 2024 I'm defending polygamy. It's like this turnaround all of a sudden for those that are afraid that a complete denial of polygamy means that there's a denial of priesthood authority, there's a denial of a prophetic mantle, there's a denial of church history even. It's like now they're having to turn around all of a sudden with this movement of denying the polygamy and start defending what we've tried to sweep under the rug for so long, right? Now, of course, you also have the internet coming along. You've got ideas at a level that is unprecedented being spread around and shared. And then, of course, you've got the Joseph Smith papers, right, where people have gone in on their own, they've delved into it, and they've pulled information out, and there's this democratization of information from experts down to everybody else. And so there's new narratives and ideas that are formed from this. So I think that also plays a part in it.
Yeah, and we should point out, though, that those that have taken this interpretation that Joseph wasn't a polygamist, they actually have some genuine points.
Sure. I
mean, when they look at the data that has been given to us, it's not perfect. And when they exercise their concern or their skepticism on it, they do have some good points. But the problem is when you put these ideas into the big picture, I think that there's really no question Joseph did practice polygamy, and that there's problems with the methodology of those that are advancing this other narrative.
Yeah. Now, you had come up with 5 different points that you wanted to cover on this, and saying this, and this I think tells us about the times, just exactly what we've been talking about here, that applies to these changes that we've seen in the transformation and transmission of knowledge here. Do you want to cover those?
Well, I would love to. I've been reading a book that talks about the methodologies of individuals who seem to be comfortable rejecting or denying conclusions that seem to be based upon a large amount of reliable scientific or historical evidence. And we can call these, I don't want to use a pejorative term, I want to be respectful. We can call them denialists, or we could call them, polygamy deniers, or monogamous model advocates, or something. But there are a lot
MMAs. Yeah. Okay.
I don't want to be disrespectful, because they do have some good points.
Appreciate
so
that.
Ignore those.
Appreciate that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, their points are part of the puzzle, right? But there were 5 things that this author in this book brings out as methodologies that I thought would be useful to just talk about in the context of polygamy denying. And The very first one is cherry picking. And I want to just give an example of this. It's going to take a minute, because to show that people might be cherry picking, you've got to show them all the other cherries on the tree that aren't being picked. And so I would like to go through and talk about 2 types of evidences. One, contemporaneous evidences that Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage. And then we'll shift over to evidences from people who aren't in the Utah church, but are either RLDS or they've left both traditions and are on their own. But I had just yesterday, incidentally, somebody messaged me on Facebook and asked me, what is the number one solid evidence that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy? And my first response was, well, there really isn't anything like that. And they said, no, there really is something like that. And that is the Kingsbury copy of Section 132. And to understand why I think that is a rock solid evidence, let's explain. It begins by looking at Joseph Smith's journal for a contemporaneous entry. For July 12, 1843, it says received a revelation in the office in the presence of Hiram Smith, his brother, and William Clayton. Now, we don't know what that revelation is, but for those who say it wasn't about polygamy, they need to come up with a good theory. That's got to be part of the counter theory. Mm-hmm. But then we go to William Clayton's journal, and that's why his journal becomes more and more important. But he wrote for that same day, he said, this morning, this AM, I wrote a revelation consisting of 10 pages on the order of the priesthood, showing the designs in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon, having many wives and concubines, etc. So here we find a convergence. We got Joseph's journal saying that there was a revelation, and Clayton was there. Probably he was scribing it. And then, well, we know he was. He later.
Do we have a date on that entry?
It's July 12, 1843. Yeah.
Oh, on July 12th, 1843, he writes it. Okay.
Both journals have that
same
date.
day as it's presented to the High Council.
Yeah. Actually, it's 1 month later. It's August 12. It's easy to get those dates.
Okay, August 12. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But what we have is that within a day or two, Newell K. Whitney, who had resources, he asked, probably paid Joseph Kingsbury to make a copy of that, and Newell K. Whitney collected revelations. He had quite a collection, and he wanted this one. So Kingsbury, a day or two later, sat down and wrote a copy of it. And that is, I sent you a video that kind of shows that. Did you already play that? Maybe.
No, let's take a look at that.
Yeah. As you look at this, I created this video to let people see all eight pages and how there are a few little edits here and there, but there really is nothing to make us think that this has been tampered with. And it's and what is more, we have eyewitness testimonials from Kingsbury who say that this is an exact copy of the Clayton one, of the Clayton version. And Clayton, we have eyewitness testimony from him saying that this is a legitimate copy. The Kingsbury copy is a legitimate copy or an accurate copy of the original that he wrote. I mean, you really can't get a much better provenance. I don't see it thumbing the pages there, Greg. I don't know. Maybe I'm not seeing it right. Oh, there you go. There you go. But you can see small edits. But this is not, a revelation that's been monkeyed with. I would argue, and you can see the original online. I just pulled these off as screenshots off of Joseph Smith Papers Project or their website. So you can see this really is a solid document. And there are people who want to say that there are weaknesses, and maybe there are a few little ones, but we have eyewitnesses saying all the way along that this is what Joseph Smith spoke. These are the very words. And the only way to really make this less is to just say that the people involved are liars. But we have other evidences that we should continue. Can
I ask you just on this also, though, Brian? Is there any extant documents on that would go beyond this? Is this everything that Kingsbury had? Are we missing anything from there that we know of? Or
no, that's a great question. The last verse 66, as it's now versified, tells us that this is the end, and there's more. He's going to reveal more in the future, but here he's making an end. So it really is a compact, a revelation. It's not open-ended. Joseph never did reveal more. This is really all we have from Joseph Smith on this topic. And there's some allusions here and there, but really, as far as teaching about polygamy, this is all we have. And again, the provenance, I think, is really solid. Let me just go through a few more contemporaneous things. And then I did send you a slide that shows the timeline for provenance. We can talk about that in a minute. But on August 12th, we have multiple late accounts saying that Hiram took this document and read it to the High Council. And we find in Franklin Richards' journal for that date that he says Hiram said before the High Council that a man shall take his brother's wife and raise up seed unto him, as it was in Israel must be again established. So here we have contemporaneous evidence that Hiram is speaking a revelation about polygamy before the High Council. Okay, it's not all late. We've got this one contemporaneous. But on January 5th of 44, Jacob Scott, in a letter to family in Canada, he relates that he has heard about a revelation that talks about plural marriage that came from Joseph Smith. And then we fast forward to June to the Nauvoo Expositor, And we find that Austin Cowles, who had been a member of the state presidency, comes out and describes the very same thing, that a revelation was read to the High Council. It talked about polygamy. And then we also have an affidavit from William Law saying he took the revelation home. And later in an interview, he said that he and his wife, he took it home and it turned them upside down. And they were very serious about considering doing what Joseph was asking them or telling them should be done with polygamy, but they ultimately rejected it. We have a third affidavit from Jane Law that corroborated her husband's affidavit. And we need to be careful, because just because they're anti-Mormon or they're apostate or they're disagreeing doesn't mean that they're automatically liars. And equally, if there's a late account of something, doesn't mean that people can't remember, especially the big issues. And these are things that we can talk about a little later. But we also have October 28th, 1843, John C. Bennett publishes in the Iowa Hawkeye a letter where he talks about how Joseph Smith has received a revelation about eternal marriage and plural marriage. So see, right there, we have 9 evidences talking about a revelation, all but the first one mentioned that it's dealing with polygamy. They're all contemporaneous. And this is strong provenance for the Kingsbury copy of Section 132, but that's not all. We have other contemporaneous evidences, and this comes back to the William Clayton journals. And we had a session at John Whitmer a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago in St. George. And there were several church historians. Robin Jensen was the lead. And they were talking about the William Clayton journals and how they're going to be published. I thought they said next year. It'll be 2 volumes, if I remember correctly. And
that might be right. I thought I remembered 2026, but I've got 2026 actually written down. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, and it may well be, but I was interested that Michelle Brady Stone was there, and she heard them present. And what they said was, obviously we can't guarantee anything. You can't prove anything in history. But he said the daily entries in his journal are clearly from Nauvoo at that time. They're describing things that we can corroborate from other sources. This is a Nauvoo journal. It's not something that appears to be constructed later because it correlates so well with other things that are happening. But what we also find in there are at least 20 references to polygamy, to either William Clayton's polygamy or Joseph Smith's polygamy, because William Clayton is a scribe for Joseph. And Clayton really didn't have a filter, so some of them are kind of weird, and some of them are hard for me to understand. But during the Q&A, I stood up and I raised my hand. I said, "Look, we know people like Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and James B. Allen were able to look at this journal and extract things and publish them, which they did. Are there any real revelations? Is there anything about polygamy that hasn't already been published?" And I can't remember which of the panel responded, but what they said was that no, pretty much, except for maybe one sentence, everything dealing with polygamy has already been published. And so I don't think when it comes out, we're going to have any big revelations. The good thing about getting it published is that the critics who want to say that it's a contrivance or something will be able to examine it and contextualize it and maybe strengthen their arguments or find out their arguments really aren't very strong. So those entries are important. They're contemporaneous.
Yeah. Okay. So there's quite a bit then contemporaneous to Joseph Smith there. What about, would we expect anything else? How does this work as far as like people's journals of families, what they've kept as heirlooms, and have most of those types of things probably been turned over to the church and copies of those things?
People have looked with a fine-tooth comb, I think, through the current repositories, including church archives, for this type of data. And I had, I hope Jed doesn't mind me mentioning, Jed Woodworth, who had worked on a number of these projects there. He pointed out to me like 5 years ago, he said, I don't think we're going to get any new documents on the topic of polygamy, except if they come from a private home or, a private family, private heirloom kind. That could be the source. But in the 11 years since I published my book, nothing has come out. There's been a handful of things I would have talked about in the book that we didn't, but there's no reason to create a second edition of it because there just hasn't been much new that has come out. But on the journals, incidentally, we have in Joseph Smith's own journal, and it's written in Taylor's shorthand, but Legine Caruth, if you've heard that name, she works for the church, but she can read Taylor's shorthand very well. But there is an entry for June 12th of 1843 saying that Joseph Smith's recording Joseph's marriage to Rhoda Richards, and also Willard Richards' polygamous marriage to Susanna Liptrot. Now, it's in Taylor shorthand, but it's there. It's a plain entry. And then we find in Brigham Young's journal for January 6th of 1842 that in Masonic cipher, there is a Joseph Smith was wed and sealed to Agnes Coolbrith. And then in Wilford Woodruff's journal for January 21, 1844, there's a whole section talking about Parley Pratt being sealed to a plural wife, and it's crossed out. Okay, so there's ambiguity there, but it's still there for that date. And then we find in the Lot family Bible, Cornelius and Permilia Lot, we find for September 20th, 1843, an entry that talks about her being given in marriage, but it doesn't give the groom's name. But later in the entry, it calls her Melissa Smith. And she is on the list, and she later testifies she was, a wife of Joseph Smith. So we do find these types of private entries that corroborate Joseph's polygamy. And then we really should mention the Martha Brotherton episode, which brought Heber Kimball and Brigham Young in, Nancy Rigdon episode, Orson and Sarah Pratt. John Bennett identified 5 of Joseph Smith's plural wives, calling them spiritual wives correctly. He used asterisks to, code them. Oliver Onley wrote a book called The Absurdities of Mormonism in 1843 and March 3rd. It talks about very explicitly some of the things going on. His private notes, which we have, and they've been published, identify wives like Louisa Beaman, Agnes Coolbrith, Emily Partridge. And this is from October of 1843. And then Thomas Bullock recorded a list of several of Joseph's plural wives in Joseph Smith's journal, but it's on the very last page. And these may have been recorded as early as October of 43 or as late as 1845. So it could have been after. But again, and then we also have a poem that was published in the Warside Messenger in 1844 in February, accusing Joseph of wanting more wives or being involved with polygamy. So I'm going to stop there. That's 20 contemporaneous evidences that Joseph Smith was involved with polygamy. And I think the ones surrounding the Kingsbury copy of DNC 132, they're just solid.
Yeah. Okay. I think, and that's overwhelming evidence right there. I think that's overwhelming evidence. However, I think that what someone denying Joseph Smith having polygamy is going to say, yeah, but where's the evidence directly from Joseph Smith? Right? Where is he talking about this specifically? And there seems to be a little bit of a hole there between Joseph, Emma, and Hiram Smith. You've brought up a couple of things here, especially looking at 132. But there is a void there, right? There's a bit of a void there because we don't have much documented from those 3 individuals.
Well, absolutely, you're right. I mean, I wish we had Joseph's signature at the end of the Kingsbury copy, or we had the Clayton copy with his signature on it. I mean, that would be a better source. And the critics, they have a good point here. On the other hand, we have a document by Kingsbury who said he's copying a document from Clayton, who is writing down Joseph's words, and we have these eyewitness testimonies of that. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yes. But let me quote somebody, who I would consider to be the expert on this topic right now is not myself. It's Mark Tensmeyer. Do you know that name?
I don't know that name.
Mark is an attorney. I think he lives in Texas. Forgive me, Mark, if I get that wrong. But he wrote an article or a chapter in the new anthology that was edited by Cheryl Bruno that was published by Signature Books a few months ago. Secret Covenant, I think is the title. But Mark Tensmeyer, in his chapter, he goes through and talks about the polygamy denier movement. He's the one who called it monogamous model advocates. Okay, That's where that came from. I'm borrowing that from Mark. But here's what he said about Joseph Smith's documentation of plural wives. He said this: the documentation of the prophet's polygamy is about what one could reasonably expect given the circumstances of secrecy. Smith's plural marriages are not any less documented than other plural marriages of the time. He rarely wrote in his own hand. He relied on scribes to keep his records, and their records indicate that he took plural wives. And considering the diversity of sources, this helps us avoid cherry picking. Okay, that's what Mark wrote. And I think it's a really great summary of why we may not really expect something that's secret to have as good a documentation from Joseph as we'd like.
Yeah, there's also I believe a very understandable current there, or I don't know what to call it, but he is not going to want to divulge this. He's already in trouble constantly, being thrown into jail, in court constantly. To go out and have evidence actually brought out for him on this is and again, this isn't evidence that he didn't, or that he didn't, but it's understandable that he's holding off, because the narrative on this, based on all of these documents, is showing that he is in polygamous relationships, but he is holding back on telling people, even Emma, about them, right? He does not want to divulge this. He doesn't want to make it public. He's trying to do it very slowly, perhaps. I'm sure there's something in his mind that is like, how do I do this? How do I actually reveal this? There are documents that talk about how he was and to some degree ashamed, to some degree concerned about what his very closest friends and family are going to think of him.
No, that's a really good point. And the problem that he's encountering, it's interesting. Greg, I can see a chess match between God and Satan throughout the 1830s. We see Joseph produces the Book of Mormon. 3 years later, the Solomon Spaulding theory shows up. And everybody jumps on that bandwagon. And that's actually the area of my current study. But then we find in 1836, there's the Kirtland Temple, and we see these incredible manifestations. Well, the very next year, you've got the Kirtland Safety Society, and Joseph is run out of Kirtland. And then we get to Nauvoo with Joseph's teachings of eternal marriage, which includes plural marriage. And who shows up? John C. Bennett with his spiritual wifery. If Bennett had showed up a year earlier or a year later, he wouldn't have near the impact on what Joseph Smith had to do, the difficulty of introducing plural marriage at that time. And so, Joseph. Yeah,
let's go into that a little bit. I mean, people probably don't know about that, but John C. Bennett is running some type of a prostitution house in Nauvoo, inside of Nauvoo, and people are walking by, going to church. They see this there. And it's like, okay, now we're going to, the idea for Joseph of, people are going to conflate this with what John C. Bennett is doing. Yeah.
And his version was very simple. It was, you can have sex as long as you don't tell anybody about it. There was no marriage ceremony. People want to say Bennett was a polygamy insider. Well, he really wasn't, because he wasn't doing polygamy. He was just having sex and keeping it secret. So lots of problems. I wrote an article, very long article, very boring article, but on this, somebody's interested in the Journal of Mormon History several years ago, but looking at Bennett's claims and comparing them to Joseph's teachings, and they're highly distinct. They're very different. But I'd still like to go on, Greg, if you're okay. I think there's more evidence that we ought to present from sources besides the Utah Church. These are people. Is that okay? I want people to understand. Go ahead.
No, I was saying put it out there. Let's do it.
All right. Well, and I've tried to just compile these to show the other cherries on the tree, so we can't just cherry pick the ones that we might like. And one of them is Leonard Sobey. He was on the High Council. He wrote an affidavit. It's in 1886, so it's later, but that doesn't mean that he can't remember, right? Okay.
And he left the church, right?
Yeah, he'd left the church, right? He hadn't joined the RLDS church. He was just by himself, but he wrote an affidavit. He named the names correctly of the other members of the High Council. He talked about how Hiram came in and read a revelation on polygamy, and he claimed that the revelation that the scribe had there, the section 132 today, was accurate. I mean, that might be a little hard to remember, but he corroborated the whole event of it being read before the High Council. Ebenezer Robinson left the church as well. He left several accounts. He said, Ebenezer Robinson and my wife, Angeline Robinson, hereby certify that in the fall of 1843, Hiram Smith, brother of Joseph Smith, came to our house in Nauvoo and taught us the doctrine of polygamy. And then in 1888, he wrote a letter to Joseph Smith III. And we're going to talk about him more here in a minute. But he wrote this. He said, Hiram Smith taught me the doctrine and told me and my first wife that he heard the voices of the Lord give the revelation on polygamy on spiritual urgings to his brother. So he's describing section 132 being given on July 12th, 1843. He's saying, I saw Joseph receive this. Again, another convergence of the historical data. James Whitehead was a scribe for Joseph. He told William Blair in 1874 that Joseph did teach polygamy and practiced it too. And Emma knows it too, that she put hands of wives in Joseph's hand. We have Sidney Rigdon, and this is after the martyrdom, but Rigdon accused Joseph of being the originator, and he had some insider knowledge because of the account with his daughter, and we won't talk about that here. And then we go back to Kirtland. Eliza Jane Churchill Webb later left the church, but she said, I know that in Kirtland, that sealing of marriages commenced there or something like it, because that's what Fanny Alger told her. So again, we have these accounts that describe what's going on in that Joseph was involved. And then one last set of data that I think is quite interesting goes with Joseph Smith III. And some people want to believe that Joseph Smith III was this adamant warrior against the idea that his dad was a polygamist. And of course, that was the outward position that he took. And yet, if and I'm grateful to Mark Tensmeyer for this, because this is in his chapter, but in the church, the RLDS Church was organized in 1860. 5 years later, the first presidency, which is led by Joseph Smith III, and one of his counselors is William Marks. Now, William Marks was the president of the Nauvoo stake and was present when the revelation was read by Hiram. So here we have another person who knows firsthand what's going on. William Marks, here's what the entry says. The question arose whether Joseph the martyr taught the doctrine of polygamy. President Marks said, Brother Hiram came to his place once and told him he did not believe in it and he was going to go see Joseph about it. And if he had a revelation on the subject, he would believe it. And after that, Hiram read a revelation on it in the High Council, and he, Marks, felt it was not true, but he saw the council receive it. Again, another corroboration from somebody who was there. It's later, okay, we're talking 1865, but corroborating that there was a revelation. It came from Joseph. It was about polygamy.
And someone just like a William Law, who would have every reason, well, they've got a reason, right, to be against to be against Joseph, and every reason in that case with the RLDS to say that there was no polygamy with Joseph Smith.
Yeah, it's here's somebody who's not anti anything but anti-polygamy, but he's admitting to it. Yeah. So but what's also interesting is that in 1882, Joseph Smith III, and I like Joseph Smith III. I don't know that I can trust everything he wrote, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm not here to denigrate him or anything, but the data is pretty clear here. In 1882, he writes a letter to his uncle because he hears his uncle is going to write a biography of Joseph. Wouldn't that have been cool? I mean, if William had written it, we would have some really good stuff that we don't have on Joseph's, early life and things. But he's going to write this. Now, here's what Joseph Smith III writes to his uncle William. I have long been engaged in removing from father's memory and from the early church the stigma and blame thrown upon them because of polygamy. Okay, that's what he's doing. But then he writes, if you, Uncle William, are the wise man I take you to be, you will fail to remember anything contrasting that lofty standard of character. So here we find him saying that we're trying to get rid of this idea of polygamy and you shouldn't remember anything like that. And William was involved. And Joseph actually set up a plural marriage for him in Nauvoo. And he had several wives and then gave it all up when he left after Joseph's death. And then one more letter, Joseph Smith III. Now this is later. This is the early 1890s. We don't have the year exact. But Joseph Smith III is writing to E.C. Brand. E.C. Brand is an RLDS missionary in Salt Lake City. So he's hearing all of the talk about Joseph Smith's wives and seeing what's published and all. Well, Joseph Smith III writes this. Yours from Provo of I guess he's living in Provo, sorry, but he's in the area. Yours from Provo of January 6th was received. And I have been getting used to contemplating my respective stepmothers and possible half-brothers and sisters. I asked you to look after the limbs of the family tree. I wanted to see if they were akin to the root. And if you can find any more mothers or aunts and can do so, just get proofs, anything that is offered. So we see here he's acknowledging in a private communication, but we have the document in his handwriting, that he knows his father was a polygamist. And then the last one on this is in 1903, he's having a discussion through the pages of a nationwide publication called The Arena. It looks like a quarterly. And Joseph Smith III is the president of the RLDS Church in Iowa. And his cousin, Joseph F. Smith, is president of the Utah Church. And they kind of get along. They kind of don't get along. They're both formidable. I mean, these are really charismatic individuals. And they're writing back and forth on the topic of polygamy. And here's what Joseph Smith III wrote in 1903. He said, the chief contention of the reorganized church and the sons of the prophet Joseph Smith is not that he was not a polygamist. So he's not arguing that Joseph didn't do it. He said, but that the dogma and practice are contrary to scripture, ancient and modern, and wrong. So I see kind of an evolution that he is learning, and there's other evidences that he was told by William Clayton, by Agnes Coolbrith. There are other evidences that Joseph Smith III clearly knew his dad was a polygamist. And here we find him acknowledging that fact, despite the fact that it took the RLDS Church until the 1980s to actually acknowledge that was the case.
Is one of those witnesses, is that where the correspondence, I think it was of I'm talking about when they were young and they had someone had visited the home of Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith III they said about these other two women, who are they? And he said, well, those are my dad's wives. Isn't that right? Yeah.
That's, yeah. I wish I had that here. I'd forgotten about that. They said Joseph Smith III was a tease. He would tease them all, but they had somebody over and he informed the visitor that these were his dad's wives. So again, he did know.
Okay. Yeah. And another thing is by this point, I mean, he might be thinking, okay, there's so much evidence coming through with all of these letters, with all these affidavits. This is all transpiring over the decades. And I think it's like, okay, it's overwhelming. I can't keep pushing back on this.
Well, I just appreciate his candor in the letters, at least, that we're seeing there. And we could go on. I mean, at this point, we could look at the Utah evidences. We could go to the affidavits. We could go to the Temple Lot depositions. We could look at Andrew Jensen's private notes or his published article on plural marriage. All of these have, again, testimonials from eyewitnesses. And I don't know if you're able to put it up, but I sent you a QR code that people can download from the internet, a compilation of over 70 eyewitnesses that, yes, there it is. If you want to just take a picture of that QR code, you can download it. It's a lengthy document, and I haven't edited it, but it's just a lot of quotes from more than 70 individuals with over 130 accounts of Joseph Smith's personal involvement with plural marriage. And again, if you're interested in that, you can download that.
Yeah. Do we want to go back to the timeline here a little bit and just show people?
Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah, just the provenance of Section 132. We talked about contemporaneous evidence, but if you look at this document, what we find here is that the revelation was kept by Noel K. Whitney, and Willard Richards made his own copy. We don't know when, and then in 1847, Brigham Young asks to have the copy, and so Noel K. Whitney's going to give it to him, but he asks his son Horace to make a copy of the Revelation, which he does. And there's 2 Horace Whitney copies at the Church History Library, and so we've got those copies as well. And then Brigham Young takes it and publishes it in 1852. And like I said, once it's published, William Clayton is still alive. Kingsbury is still alive, and they're telling everybody that this is what Joseph Smith spoke, and so the conspiracyists have got to come up with some explanation for how we have these eyewitnesses, anything short of bald-faced lying, telling us that this came from Joseph Smith's mouth, and so the provenance really is very solid on that document.
Now, on the Kingsbury pages, as those were turning, I didn't see a lot of scratches. Like you said, there's very little editing. one of the claims I've heard is that there was a lot of change from Brigham Young, that he had X'd out a lot of things and added in a lot on Section 132, that it's mostly his writing, or a big portion of his writing. Is there anything to that?
No, it's wishful thinking on the part, I think, of the denialists, because the document is there. You can look at it. We have samples of Kingsbury's writing that you can compare. It's all there. Again, these eyewitnesses, short of being bald-faced liars, are giving us a really solid document showing Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage. And I don't know. Very few documents have as good a provenance as this Kingsbury copy of Section 132.
And we also had here. Did you want to go over this one also?
Yeah, let's do that. In fact, let's go back to the 5 methodologies that this author identifies for the denialist approach. Mm-hmm. The first one was cherry picking. And so what I've tried to do is just provide so many other cherries to illustrate that if we want a plausible counter narrative saying Joseph didn't do polygamy, we've got to account for all of these other convergences and evidences and to avoid the accusation of cherry picking. The second thing involves conspiracy theories. The denialist approach has usually some conspiracy theories, and sometimes it's absolutely necessary, because you've got to explain all the counter narrative somehow, and describe why these men and women would say the things that they say. And the conspiracy theorist will sometimes say, well, Brigham was threatening them with excommunication or something like that. And so these people are all banding together and making up this narrative that we're going to say Joseph did it, but we all know he didn't. And if you want to show that document now, the reason I put this on, why I shared this with you, is this is Don Bradley's finding. And it's really a cool document. If you look at the top part, you see the handwriting changes about midway. The top is written by Andrew Jensen. Now, my friend Don Bradley's doing this research for me back in 2008 or 2009. But he's looking at this going, that handwriting changed. Who is writing the bottom half of this list of Joseph Smith's wives? And he's trying to figure it out. He goes to Andrew Jensen's journal. He knows he's talking to Melissa Lott, a plural wife. He's talking to Eliza Snow. And he arranged for me to be there when Jill Durr is a church historian. She's now retired, but she's an expert on Eliza Snow. And she looks at that for me and she goes, yeah, that's Eliza Snow's writing. So what happened is he's writing down he's creating a list of Joseph Smith's plural wives. And at some point he just takes the paper and hands it to Eliza Snow. Now this is 1886. Okay, Brigham Young has been dead almost 10 years, and she is over 80. Eliza is over 80. So what we've got to do, if we're going to explain how Joseph really wasn't a polygamist, is explain why Eliza Snow, in this setting, is going to lie again and again and again and create this list of 10 or 12 additional names for Andrew Jensen. You'll see Fanny Alger's name is right on there as a wife. And of course, she was there in Kirtland, Eliza was, and knew Fanny Alger. So she adds these names. And again, I don't think that there is a real solid counter narrative. I don't think the conspiracy narrative works to explain why people would do what they are doing here, how this diverse body of evidence could manufacture so many interconnected narratives from anti-Mormons, apostates, Utah Church, RLDS, and they all are telling the same story, that Joseph Smith introduced and practiced plural marriage.
Yeah. So for me, I don't know that I haven't sometimes a problem with a conspiracy theory, as long as the conspiracy theory is short-lived and then there's evidence brought forward that says something different. We've seen that happen several times. The problem, I look at this, and this is one of the things I say, again, there are places to look. I think even Jacob 2 scripturally is a little ambiguous, and I can understand how people would take a different take on that. And, but the idea that there is all of this evidence, all of these affidavits, all of these journal entries, all of these documents that we have from the church, from church history, and that they are all false, or they are all, as you said, Brigham Young is going to excommunicate anybody who doesn't fall in line with the narrative that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. The problem is that I don't know, and maybe there is something, but I don't know of a single document. I've asked several people anywhere in history that goes outside of that and says, hey, I was a plural wife. I've left the community, as an example. I've left the community, and I know that Brigham Young was putting this all together and telling us all that we were, coercing us all to do this. And actually Joseph Smith never did practice polygamy. I don't know of anything anywhere that slips out from that bubble, right? That says the opposite. And it's almost certain that you would have several examples of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I appreciated you actually asked Michelle Brady Stone on that program if there had been anybody who had spilled the beans, so to say, and say, no, exactly. This was a Brigham Young conspiracy. And let me quote Mark Tensmeyer. He said, fortunately for historians, people, especially a large number of people, are notoriously bad at keeping secrets. Yes. And I mean, none of the conspiracists later came out and said, okay, Joseph didn't do it. It was all Brigham. That nobody said that. And I think that's further corroborating the reality that he was the one who originated.
Yeah, and that's to me is where I can appeal to something. I can appeal to common sense. That to me is a commonsensical issue that you're going to have several of those types of examples that you're going to be able to pull from. And I don't, and maybe something will show up. I don't know, but I don't know of anything that claims that Brigham was lying and coercing everybody and telling everyone that Joseph Smith actually did practice polygamy when he didn't.
The third characteristic or methodology of the denialist approach is how they deal with experts. And according to the book, they rely on less qualified, if you will, experts, and they criticize or ignore or mock the real experts. And I can show you there. This book is written by Larry Foster, who looked at it. He's not a Latter-day Saint. He's a well-respected historian. He was president of the Mormon History Association, president of the John Whitmer Historical Association. He's ignored in their literature. I haven't seen anybody who cares about talking about him. Todd Compton's book, And Sacred Loneliness. Todd's a friend of mine. We don't see eye to eye on everything, but he's a very fine historian. Again, these are experts that really receive no attention from this group, and yet these are people that they ought to, I think, be paying attention to. And maybe you would consider me an expert, and I sent you a link to a video that was made about me. And it's quite entertaining, and that's why I thought maybe you'd want to play it. It's only 50 seconds long. We'll just play the intro, and then I'll explain the context. But it just kind of shows you there that I don't think I'm being respected. At least I don't know. We let them decide. But people call me an apologist, and I get it. But I wish they'd call me a transparencyist.
Transparency is. He's hailed as the world's #1 transparencyist. But delve into his deeds, persist, and you.
Someone put some time into this.
Transparency is. He's the world's worst transparencyist. I'll go through my list and give you the gist of why he's the worst transparencyist.
I love transparency. Bring on transparency.
On today's Adventures of the World's Worst Transparencyist, Brian C. Hales discusses Emma's final deathbed denial of Joseph's polygamy from her interview with her son, Joseph Smith III.
I mean, that's a clever. That's a pretty clever thing. Like
pretty well done.
When I was in high school and college, I played in a band, and if you listen to the track, I mean, there's a bass track, there's a drum track, there's a rhythm guitar, I think there's a lead guitar, and then you've got the audio. The singer is a much better singer than I've ever been, and they had to make up the lyrics and make them rhyme, and then bring in all of the visuals. And I think she's taken this down. I think she received some negative feedback, and in her defense, what it's about is that in an interview on Saints Unscripted, I misremembered a data point. I claimed that there were no notes for Joseph Smith III's final interview of Emma talking about the polygamy topic. And apparently there are, and Michelle found them. Good for her, because I had I talked to the archivists at Community of Christ to try to find them. They couldn't find them for me. I'm still wondering if the actual first draft of the notes from the interview was really typeset ready. I worry that there's still another draft in there we don't have, but there are indications that this could be it. And so I was wrong. I made a mistake. And that's why I am the world's worst transparencyist. And of course, the word transparencyist is a made up word. But what it means is that I think we need to get all the documents out there and let everybody read what they want. And then they can decide for themselves what they want to conclude. You see, the opposite of that are people that just grab the evidences that support the conclusion they want to persuade you to embrace. See, there's a spectrum there, transparency on one end and persuasiveness, agree with me on the other. And it's kind of an annoying term. In fact, my sweet wife, Janice, says, I can't even say that word. So, but it's transparencyist. It just means that you're advocating transparency. And as a believer, let me just add one more thing, that having studied polygamy and tried to see every known document on Joseph Smith's polygamy, and also for the last 10 years studied the origin of the Book of Mormon and how Joseph Smith was able to dictate it, I believe that in transparency, there is plenty of room for faith. Okay, not everybody's going to agree. I don't have that illusion, but there's lots of room for people to hold religious belief if you're getting the data directly and not filtered through me or an anti-Mormon or somebody else. So,
yeah. Well, and you do a very good job of that. Honestly, you are a pretty good transparencyist. I've gone through your stuff, and you put stuff out there that I know is going to make people uncomfortable too. So you're pretty open on it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The fourth methodology is that they commit logical errors. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that because it's kind of subjective, but I have an example, because there are people who are saying in Nauvoo that Joseph Smith was fighting polygamy, but he just couldn't quite be successful. Those renegade apostles, they were just doing their own thing, and poor Joseph, he just couldn't get them to stop. And I think that is a fallacy. To believe that, I think it's inaccurate. And Benjamin F. Johnson said this about Joseph, okay? He said, although he could be so social and convivial at times, he would allow no arrogance or undue liberties and criticism, even by associates. And this was rarely acceptable, and contradiction would rouse in him the lion at once, for by no one of his fellows would he be superseded or disputed. Now, this is Joseph in Nauvoo, and this is not a complimentary description, really. It sounds autocratic. And there are others that kind of, now we have the other side of him too, that he's so caring and empathetic. But what I'm seeing here is not a Joseph Smith that would have let the apostles run off and practice polygamy and he couldn't get a control on it. To me, that is a logical error. That just doesn't, the evidence is not there to support it. And the counter evidence and logic and common rationale would tell us that, no, this really isn't what happened there. They may say that Joseph Smith denied polygamy, and I've written an article, and you've got a QR code actually for that article if people want to download it, because a few years ago, I heard people say Joseph was denying polygamy all the time. So I said, okay, let's just compile them all. Let's compile all of the denials of Joseph Smith. And there were so few that it didn't make for a full article. So I decided to pull in Emma's denials, and also, let's see, that's the Eliza Snow document we're seeing, or is it? No, you've got it. I'm sorry, I'm seeing the wrong one. But so I pulled in Hiram's denials and Emma's denials, and I'm not worried about Joseph's denials. There's enough ambiguity in there to allow for him to be not lying, but at the same time, he's not divulging secret polygamy. But Emma and Hiram both made statements. It's like, dudes, I think that is not exactly accurate. So, but the what we find in Joseph Smith is that despite the denials, however we want to characterize them, and promises to root out secret polygamy, they simply don't align with his actions. He conducted no investigations after the Bennett incident in 1842. No individuals in the Nauvoo area faced any consequences for involvement with authorized plural marriage. And so I think we just need to use the data and use it in a logical fashion. And then the fifth and the final methodology involves they set an impossible standard for contradictory evidence. And I think you encountered this in your previous interview, because it's true that there are people who said they saw a copy of Section 132, but it was only one page, or it was only 3 pages. So we see this discrepancy there. And we also can point out that Emily Partridge said she was married, sealed to Joseph Smith by James Adams on a date when James Adams wasn't in Nauvoo. So what do? Do we just throw out the whole evidence? Well, of course we don't. But we just recognize that the historical record is not going to be complete. There's going to be contradictions. There's going to be inaccuracies. There's going to be ambiguities. And we have to take everything and bring it together. And I think when we do that, there's just no question Joseph Smith introduced and practiced plural marriage. So I appreciate you letting me going through all 5 of those. But I see in this movement that's denying Joseph Smith's involvement with polygamy, I see them involving themselves with cherry picking the evidence, with conspiracy theories, with reliance on experts that really have never published in a peer-reviewed journal, and doing an ad hominem on some of those that have spent a lot of time studying this. The logic sometimes is hard to follow. And then lastly, just the standard of evidence that they demand for the contradictory evidence, it seems to be quite different from that they're using for themselves. It seems like their own evidence may be examined with a telescope, but the contradictory evidence is examined with a microscope or something like that. Now, I'm not saying they don't have good points. I don't want to sound too critical of this, but when we get the big picture there's just ample evidence, I think, to show Joseph was involved.
Yeah, and I said this, I don't remember if I said this in the interview with her, but, I have in the comments, I'm actually very impressed by how far she's dug into this, all the research that she's done, and information that she's pulled up. I wish all of us would do more of this, right, whether it's history or digging into the scriptures, and so I admire that. I think that's great. That's one of the reasons I brought her on, because I knew she had done so much on this. It's just the conclusions I don't agree with. I just don't agree with the conclusions that she's coming to. I'm thinking that, Brian, here, something that's coming up here in my mind here. I don't know. Because I haven't thought this through. Let me think here. This should be relevant. Are there any women that practiced polygamy that were sealed to Joseph Smith that kept the Smith name? Or were they all sealed to somebody else afterward?
That's a great question. In fact, the answer is kind of interesting. I'm not sure about all of the wives, but I can tell you that after Emma Smith's denial that was published in 1879, months after her death, after Emma Smith's death, Eliza R. Snow said that if that's really what she wrote, she died with libel on her lips. And from that moment forward, Eliza R. Snow started signing her name, Eliza R. Snow Smith. Okay. So she picked up Joseph's last name from that point forward, which is just interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. It would be interesting to find that out, right? If any of these women held on to that Smith name, even just for a while, until they were resealed or married to somebody else, it would be seems like another data point there to
good point
to look at. So. Okay. Anything else that you wanted to bring up in this, Brian, at all that you think is pertinent and important to state? I want to say this, right? I think there are a number of people that are kind of jumping onto this bandwagon with denying that Joseph Smith ever had polygamy. I think this has been around for a very long time. I understand that some people are going to feel the repulsion to this. And it's going to be a main motivator to look into it deeper. And I don't think anybody that believes that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy has a problem in judgment, right? And I don't mean their own judgment. I mean in the judgment, going into the next life. It's not a big deal. The only issue I have on relating to that is it going to lead to an undermining of the prophet's mantle of the church and a belief in the church, and also especially going back to Brigham Young, and his character and who he was and what he believed, and that's the problem I have. And more, the temple, right? Because these are all overlapping issues here, and so that has happened. I see this spectrum of, on that the interview with Michelle. I think there's like 3,200 comments on it, so you get a really good data collection, right, of where people are. And you've got this spectrum of those that are, look, I am a firm Latter-day Saint. I believe that President Nelson is a prophet. I just don't believe that Joseph Smith practiced this, all the way to the other end of, you're a Brighamite. I can't believe that you believe that, Brigham Young put together this cabal and President Nelson, is not a prophet and the church isn't true because Joseph Smith's gone. So you get that whole spectrum there. But I don't think that it's valuable to attack individuals because they have a belief that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy. I do believe that we need to be careful on those other issues and where that can lead.
Well, you bring up a good point. There's that saying that when you pick up a stick, you pick up both ends. Mm-hmm. And people can say, well, I just don't believe Joseph did it. The problem with that, and I'll be honest with you, I think people who embrace that as a belief have entered a halfway house to apostasy. I mean, they're at the way station on their way out. And let me tell you why. Because they usually believe polygamy is just bad and wrong. But they also have to deal with Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, Joseph S. Smith. All of these people, the first Joseph S. Smith, they all knew Joseph. And all but Joseph S. Smith knew and reported that Joseph taught them about polygamy. Mm-hmm. And so they all, they're lying.
Yeah, that's the only conclusion you can come up with. They're lying.
And so what you have to do is accept Joseph was a prophet and everybody after him is lying about polygamy, but they're still good prophets. I can still follow them. That I don't think is a livable paradigm. I think that's a problem. I think in time faith that tries to manipulate that picture to be a useful way to grow closer to God, it's going to break down and they're going to be out of it. And what more is, usually the message is, and I heard this the other day in that interview that you did, was that polygamy is so bad for women. It is so heartless. It is so mean for women that Joseph wouldn't have done it, and God would never require it. Now, I've heard that many times before, and I don't disagree. I don't like polygamy. I heard you say multiple times you don't like polygamy. Mm-hmm. Men can do it. Women can't. It's unfair. I would never try to defend it. But the reality is that we are just doing, as Neil A. Maxwell said, looking at the second act of a 3-act play. And what I say is that right now, today, at this moment, there is a baby being born in Zimbabwe to abject poverty. At the same time, a baby is born to privilege in Boston or to an LDS family in Idaho. And yet we believe God is just in doing that. Well, of course, it doesn't appear just to us. God can do things, and we just don't have the ability to judge. So the argument that is made is that polygamy is so mean and so hard, and it is. I'm not disputing that, but that is a reason why Joseph wouldn't have done it or God wouldn't have commanded it. I don't find that to be very persuasive.
It's an emotional argument, and I tried to bring that up. It's an emotional argument, and that's okay to start something. But you can't stay there with just an emotional argument. It doesn't, and there's a logical fallacy there. I mean, again, I think I brought up that, Abraham was asked to kill his own son, Isaac. And why would God ever put him through that? Nephi was asked to kill Laban. And why would he ask him to murder? There are, Brian, we're moving, I think, in our culture and maybe even in the church culture into more of a place of we just don't want adversity, and we don't want judgment on these things, and so I think we come more and more as we move on. We move in this culture. We come more and more from that position of, well, God it's not the justice God, it's just the mercy God, and therefore, that's all He's going to give us is wonderful times. Of course, look at Joseph Smith himself in section 121, and what. As the Lord appears to him, it's not, okay, let me put my arm around you and I'm sorry you've had to go through this. It's the exact opposite. have you reached Job? Have you reached who I am? And, adversity is a part of this. Now, again, that doesn't prove anything one way or the other.
Well, it requires us to kind of judge God, which we can't do. And then we're here to face noxious weeds and, thorns and thistles and things. That's what we signed up for when we agreed to fall with Adam and Eve. And that maybe this is part of that. So I think we have to be really careful. You mentioned the temple, and it breaks my heart when I hear people talk about the temple kind of the way they do, as because what we're seeing is unprecedented. The changes that we've seen to the teaching portion of the endowment there in the last 5 or 6 years are just incredible. And one thing that has been changed, and I think it's fine to talk about this, but in the opening part, it says, "We hope you'll find joy serving and worshiping in the house of the Lord." That word "and worshiping" didn't used to be there. We were looking at it, the temple more as a place to go and serve, saviors on Mount Zion, doing work for the dead. But now bringing these temples closer to us, what our leaders are trying to do is help us to go there and to fortify ourselves spiritually. And, the promise of President Nelson in the last conference, not last week, but before, was that the Lord promises he will manifest himself to us in the temple. And he says, ponder what that means for you. I mean, these are incredible promises that come from the temple. And when I hear people who just don't feel the temple is all that needed for our personal growth or for work for the dead, I find that unfortunate, I guess is the best word to use.
Yeah, and it's, and the temple, is not a Brigham Young invention. It is comes before that. It's actually, the whole idea of the temple's been around for a very, very long time, probably all the way back to Adam and Eve, and it's at least the endowment. So it is unfortunate that people separate that and start to listen to voices that are starting to say, well, Christianity should have nothing to do with the temple. The temple is Christianity. The temple is Christianity, and it is putting on Christ as you're going through the temple. That's essentially what you're doing. So, it's an interesting time. And again, I find it fascinating that these 3 points of the RLDS / Community of Christ teachings are where these issues are coming up, which is polygamy, Brigham Young, and the temple. And these are the primary, targets right now of those that are, of testimonies and stones being thrown to the church.
Well, there was talk about we can't trace the temple ceremony back to Joseph. I do not understand that statement at all. We have books that are written that compile all of them. And I was just looking back. It's in my other room, which is a little library, but there have been full compilations of all of the references to the temple endowments. Andrew Ehat wrote an amazing dissertation, or was it a thesis, master's thesis years ago, that outlined all of this stuff. And to say that this doesn't go back to Joseph Smith is just a naive position, I think. And let me share one thing with you, though, that I found to be interesting. We hear about the covenant path a lot. Do you know when the first person mentioned the covenant path in General Conference? Because I didn't grow up with that.
I've not heard this.
Yeah. Did you ever hear it as a child?
I don't remember it.
Yeah, we didn't have it. And so I looked it up. You can do this online. There's a corpus, General Conference corpus, and you can search for phrases. But it was 2007 that Elaine Dalton first mentioned
one of my favorites.
The path. Yeah. And it had been mentioned in the Ensign a year before by Elder Holland. But here it's just bread and butter Mormonism now. Last conference, not a week ago, half the 12 and 2 of the 31st presidency mentioned the covenant path. The reason that's so important is, where do we make our covenants? We make our covenant of baptism. We get into the covenant path. But really, that's all that we're doing. Men get the priesthood, and we renew covenants each week with the sacrament, but we don't really advance very far in the covenant path until we get into the temple. So people who minimize the importance of the temple and these covenants they're just limiting their own ability, because there are 5 covenants that we make in the temple. These are all outlined on LDS.org, what they are. And it's through those covenants made in the temple, we bind ourselves to Christ in a holy place. And that is where we gain spiritual power. And again, maybe this doesn't address the origin of these, but I think it's very well traced back to Joseph Smith.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, who gave Brigham Young the endowment? Yeah, Elaine Dalton, I'm glad you brought her up. I'm going to be with her in a couple of months. I'm actually going to Egypt with her next year. So she's one of my very favorites all time. Yeah. Brian, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate your knowledge and the research that you do on this. I hope that people look at this and they can pull in all of this evidence. We wanted to open up the doors as much as possible on this evidence. And you're probably going to have to go through this a few times, and pick up all the points that are on it, because there's so much. That's kind of the point. There's so much evidence on this. So appreciate your time very much, and good luck on things you're going to be going to here in just a bit.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being on here, Greg.